Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the latest in the series online. And today's speaker is Pauline Roussel. Pauline is co-author of a book called Around the World in 250 Co-working Spaces. And I'm pleased to say that one of you lucky attendees this morning will win a copy of that book. We will get that sent to you. And because it's a smaller number, you've got a greater chance of being able to win that. There will be a follow-up email with lots of links where you can also buy the book, but also lots of information. Pauline has been really good to give us lots of follow-up material as well. And I do love that at one point, Pauline worked in a co-working space as the Chief Happiness Officer. So I hope today, amongst all the gloom going on, you can bring us some happiness today. Pauline, I'm going to hand over to you, and thank you everyone for joining us. Please do use the chat box for any comments, observations, or questions as we go along. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Hi, everyone. I'm actually tuning in from Plovdiv, Bulgaria. I'm based in between Berlin and Plovdiv, but I'm really happy to be here, and I would like to thank you again, Mark, for this opportunity to talk about co-working. So yeah, as you said, my name is Pauline Roussel. In case the accent wasn't obvious, I'm from France. And together with Dimitar, whom you see on the picture here, we indeed co-authored a book about co-working around the world, which I'm going to get to in a second. Just to give you a little bit of understanding about what will happen today. So I have the great mission to actually help you guys understand the co-working a little bit better. So I'm going to take you through a journey where we are going to understand together where did co-working come from, how has it evolved over the years, and where is it going? I think Mark emphasized it already, but I do love questions and comments. So please don't be shy. Bring on your questions in the chat and we'll get, we do have time afterwards to answer those. So don't be shy and just drop your questions in the chat. And now you might also wonder, what do I actually know about co-working? I think Mark also started to explain that I actually, my co-working journey started in Berlin. Back in 2015, I became the Chief Happiness Officer of the co-working space you see here on those pictures. The co-working space, so for those of you who love buildings and stories, this used to be a factory for Trabant cars. And it was about 2,000 square meters, 20,000 square feet. And we transformed it into co-working space targeted at early stage startups. So that was a really exciting space. We had about 200 to 250 members on the daily. And this is also where I met Dimitar, because he was working for a startup accelerator that was sitting within that co-working space. And looking at the daily interactions within the space, Dimitar and I started to ask ourselves what kind of impact co-working has on people who use them, but also on cities in which they exist. And to give you a bit of an example of an image of what we mean, this is like a picture of Berlin prior to any opening of co-working. And this is a picture of the page number 1 on Google Maps when you type co-working in Berlin. And so our question at the beginning was really to understand what are all those red dots bringing to a city like Berlin, and also what are the people using co-working spaces in Berlin getting out of their experience in co-working spaces. So to find out answers to our questions, we started a little research project at the beginning, where we went to interview different co-working operators in the city, always with those two questions. So how do you bring value to your members? How do you see your neighborhood being impacted by the opening of your space? And I think in the early stages of our journey, we interviewed around 30 founders in Berlin. And then one day at a breakfast in our co-working space, there was the founder of a co-working space in Italy who invited us to come to Italy to actually see his co-working space, because he had a very interesting component plugged to it, which was education. So we flew to Milan, and Milan was actually the beginning of a very interesting journey. And one of the things we started to realize throughout our survey, in the survey we ran in Berlin and the work we started to do in Milan, was that co-working had this beautiful power of like impacting neighborhoods in that sense of like, especially in Berlin, many buildings were left abandoned or were just unused. And due to like cheaper rents or more like further away places or residential neighborhoods, which at the time were not as popular as they would be now, people would start to get into those old buildings, renovate them, and then a few years down the road, this would become a really active what is written here, creativity hub, but like co-working with cafe, and that would really change the neighborhood. And we've noticed that in many instances. And so from Milan, we actually never stopped traveling. So over the last 7 years, we had the chance to visit 500 co-working spaces across 50 cities. So our journey took us all the way from Tokyo, Bombay, Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, all the way to New York. And that has been a journey. I'm not gonna lie. I was at the Coworking Europe conference lately, and I said I think we took all transportation modes except helicopter. So we were quite often on the road over the last 7 years, and we've met incredible concepts, incredible people who are really pushing things forward when it comes to giving access to flexibility and community-driven type of workplaces around the world. Those are just a few of the 500 selfies we took with some of the people we've met. And of course, traveling has also shaped our mission. So why are we doing this? And along the way, we started to really understand that what we were doing was really just to help co-working get better, and we want to make co-working better. So the way we do that today is twofold. On one hand, we educate companies, universities, institutions. We help them to understand co-working better and how it can work for them. And then, of course, we work as consultants a lot with co-working teams, and we support them in creating better spaces and better experiences for their members. Along the way, and as Mark, and that's what I'm going to focus on today, as Mark has said, we released actually about a few months ago a coffee table book called Around the World in 250 Co-working Spaces, which is for us really a traveling experience for readers that features 250 spaces we've met. It's also human stories on how people got to start co-working spaces around the world, how did they grow them, how did they adapt throughout the pandemic. And it's a book that we self-published and also that we self-promote. And it's, as a lot of people we've met along the way say, it's a big labor of love and also kind of a celebration to what the co-working world looks like today around the world. We also worked with companies that support the co-working industry to showcase different use cases and how co-working can get better in terms of experience. To better understand also what co-working is today, I think we need to travel a little bit back in time and look at how it even became a thing. So what's interesting to understand when we look at co-working is that it's very connected to economical factors, but also to technology advancements. So for instance, if we look at the end of the 90s, when Black Monday happened, there was a huge spike of empty offices, so companies getting rid of their offices. And as a result, there was a precursor of co-working, I should say, oh, sorry, I went the wrong way. In 1989, actually, you might have heard of Regus. They belong to the IWG group today, but Regus was founded. And although they are not co-working, they're rather a business center. What they brought to the world was the notion of flexibility, because that's what companies wanted. As the world was uncertain, people didn't want to commit for a long lease, people didn't want to have to manage an office, and they were seeking more flexibility in the way they consumed the office. So in 1989, we just offered that option to companies. And of course, along the way, as I just said, technology advancements also really pushed, as you can see on this video that has been done by Harvard Business Review, many of the things we're having on our desks over the last 2 decades maybe started to become more and more digital. So no more fax, no more fixed phone, or no more newspaper, no more fixed computer. Everything started to get into laptops, phones, which meant also that for many of us, white-collar workers at least, it became very easy to start to work from other places than the office. And actually, in 2005, this is the very official first year that the very first co-working space opened its doors in San Francisco. As you can see, it was very simple type of layouts, but I think the real idea behind that was to bring people together who are not necessarily working for the same company and allow them to have flexibility in the way they approach work. And in the meantime, it's also something very discussed. So I have to acknowledge that between 1989 and 2005, there were indeed many shared office or shared spaces type of concepts. The one you see on top, for instance, opened in 1999, and they're still open today in Berlin. They're called C-Space, and they are more of a hacker space. And the one you see at the bottom is called Schauenfabrik, and they opened in Vienna in 2002. But again, they didn't brand themselves as co-working, so they were more called shared spaces. In the recap email that you will receive after this event, there will be an article from the inventor of co-working as a space, Brad Neuber, which I invite you to read. It's very interesting to understand what was his idea and his vision behind starting a co-working space. 2010 was also a very important year for co-working as an industry. It is the year that WeWork officially arrived on the market. So if you don't know WeWork, they're one of the main co-working players around the world. And while, of course, many have criticized WeWork and its ways, there's really one thing we can give to them and to any of the big co-working and flex brands is that whenever they were expanding in other regions of the world, they highly contributed to educating society at large to what co-working can be. Because, of course, not all co-working spaces have to look like them. But actually, because they were investing so much into marketing budgets to promote their spaces, they also gave visibilities to other operators and allowed people to look for alternatives if they didn't want to be in WeWork or Spaces or Regus, for instance. Between 2010 and 2018, co-working has actually steadily grew across all corners of the globe. Major brands also started to merge or being bought. I'm thinking, for instance, about Spaces, which was originally a brand from the Netherlands, who got acquired by IWG in 2015. And also, I have to say that growth happened at different pace, primarily, of course, motivated and connected to the tech ecosystems or to nomads. So, for instance, for us, when we were in Berlin, because co-working in Berlin started around 2006, there were Spaces, official co-working that opened in 2006, and we were there in 2015. We saw many, many co-working spaces. But then when we got to travel in places like Japan, for instance, we noticed that co-working was, back in 2017, co-working was still, to rise or to become a very popular thing. And this was also, I think, connected to the way people work and to the Japanese culture at work. So, of course, it grew at different paces everywhere around the world. And today, I think if you go to markets like London or New York, you can see how active and dynamic co-working scenes are in those two cities in particular. 2019 has been quite a bad year for co-working, again, because of popularity that those big brands have. They kind of bear the responsibility or actions for other co-working operators. And if you haven't heard about the failed IPO of WeWork, I also put an article in the recap email that you can dive into. You might have seen this series on Apple TV, which is called We Crashed, and which explains the whole story behind WeWork. But the reason why I highlighted this is because back in 2019, and WeWork had received so much investments to grow their co-working brand. So when their IPO failed, it really shed a bad light on co-working, and a lot of investment and investors started to doubt the model. So that was kind of a hard year for co-working operators generally. And a lot of them had to recover and to prove by doubling their efforts or tripling their efforts that co-working was here to stay. Obviously, in 2020, I don't know, I can't recall how many articles I've read that co-working was dead and that it was the end of co-working because of the pandemic and the fact that the office space as a physical space became absolutely irrelevant. It has been, I think, really a hard year for a lot of co-working operators around the world. But I think a lot of them also saw it as an opportunity to grow and to show their magic, which I'm going to get into in a minute. But what was also interesting, and maybe you guys can relate in different regions of the world, the status of co-working was not very well understood by certain local governments. So, for instance, because we were staying very close to our community and we were talking with a lot of operators during the pandemic, some of them were saying that they are not an office or they were not a hospitality business, so the government was not really telling them what to do, if they should close or remain open or whatever. So they were able to navigate and support their communities because they were not officially recognized by any government. And they were also, of course, that was the bad thing, was that for some of them in certain regions of the world, I don't want to make a generalization here, but in certain regions of the world, they were also not able to get any financial support because they had no recognition. But of course, co-working today has completely grown. And it's not just for freelancers and startups anymore. I think that's really one of the key messages that we share to everyone we speak with, be it companies, institutions, even co-working operators. And the book is really the perfect example highlighting that today co-working has grown. And I'm going to show you a few examples right now that are coming from the book of how much co-working has grown and diversified. But before I do that, I also want to acknowledge the press and say that in 2020, they declared it dead. And now, if you read the press, because of the upcoming recession, people are starting to, or journalists are starting to describe co-working as a game changer. And to go back to my point of looking at economic, the state of the economy or economical factors, co-working has always has thrived in economic crisis because, of course, a lot of the companies, be it big companies, startup, freelancers, reduce their office footprint and they go into co-working spaces because it's more flexible. It's also a little bit more affordable and they don't have to deal with it. So with the upcoming recession that we are hearing of at the moment, many are looking at be it big companies or anyone, are currently looking at co-working spaces. And I think, as I just said earlier, it is really time for the wider world to embrace what co-working is. It's also, the industry has been around for 2 decades. And as I just said, you see how things have changed. And the co-working industry has proven few times, how it can thrive and positively impact communities in good and harder times. The first co-working space I'd like to highlight is actually a co-working space based in Barcelona. So if we have people watching this now or later who are based in Barcelona, I would invite you to go and check Nest City Lab. I've put on top their Instagram account if you're curious to follow them. What's really interesting with them, for instance, is that they have been paving the way for sustainability at work and like a new way to consume the office that's more sustainable, more green. So, for instance, to give you a little bit of a background on their story, it started by 3 French people who are in Barcelona. They started in another building, and then they moved into what was, I believe, a ship garage or warehouse. And then they build a structure that can be totally dismantled whenever they would leave the space. So their carbon footprint or footprint within the building was minimal. And also they built within the space, so you see a lot of greenery. This is actually an edible garden. And what's really beautiful about their story is that they invite chefs from the city to come and cook with some of the ingredients of the garden and some of the ingredients from local producers, to help people reconnect with seasons, reconnect with what we should eat wherever we're based. And also a lot of their members, actually, one of the criteria to join is that you commit to have a more sustainable approach in your work practices, but also maybe you accept to educate yourself and keep learning on how you can become more aware and about the global warming crisis. Another example I want to highlight, which is in Berlin, called Jago Hub. Again, if we have Berliners in the audience, I would invite you to go and pay them a visit. This is actually a co-working space for parents, which is quite amazing. So it means that parents can book in-house daycare where they can bring their little ones. And this has been particularly helpful for young parents, be it mother or fathers, because in Germany, the parental leave can be shared equally between fathers and mothers. And sometimes it's true that it's hard to completely disconnect, because in Germany, I think the parental leave is about 12 to 14 months. And some people might want to return to work, especially if you run your own business or if you're a freelancer. It's just hard to not work. And Jago Hub really support that type of community to get back to work a few hours a day and have their kids taken care of while they do that. But in the meantime, what's really interesting is that they started collaborating with larger companies, for instance, Coca-Cola, as they were explaining in the book. And so some of the Coca-Cola employees can come to the space, book the daycare, bring their children, and know that they will be taken care of while they do their work. Another example from San Francisco, and also they do have a space in Berlin, it's called Kitchen Town. So Kitchen Town is actually a co-working space for chefs and for food professionals. Again, very interesting model. The space is divided in few areas because, of course, catering businesses can prepare and share kitchen with latest equipments to prepare the catering for the clients. But then you also have a lot of food startups or food companies who can use the lab and who can use the facility to test and work on the products that they want to launch. We've been to the one in Berlin recently, and for instance, there was a startup there who produced a vegan tuna, so vegan tuna fish. And it's very interesting to see. And they were actually quite successful. They won a few prizes in Germany for that. And all of that was started out of Kitchen Town in Berlin, which is a co-working space. Another example, Fashion for Good in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. This is actually a co-working space and a museum around sustainable fashion that was started by a group of large companies, C&A, Adidas, and a few other ones, in order to educate the public to new fashion practices or how we can do more sustainable fashion. And that goes through the museum, where the experience they create changes, I think, every 6 months. They invite artists to present their work with new materials that they are experimenting with and explain their work. But also on the higher floors, you have a co-working space where fashion startups or fashion professionals can come, work, connect with the community, present their work, see different materials, and have access to a network of like-minded professionals. Another example from the Netherlands, which you might know as the Student Hotel, they just rebranded to the Social Hub. And what is really interesting is that they blend co-working, co-living, hospitality all together. They actually started in Rotterdam quite a few years ago, but they have 17 locations across Europe today, and they are growing massively. If you go in any of their cities where they are, I would highly recommend you to visit their spaces, because it's really amazing how they blend everything together. So people can access co-working spaces, which is really often targeted to people living in the neighborhood. Then they have students, people coming from abroad to study in, I don't know, Rotterdam, Berlin. They're also in Vienna, for instance, where they live there for quite some time. And then they have hotel guests, so people who are on a business trip and would stay in the hotel for some time, but also need a place, professional place like you see here, to work. And then they do, of course, a lot of events open to the public and connected to the city where they are based. Yet another example, the Coven, which is from Minneapolis in the USA. This is a co-working space targeted at women and underrepresented communities. Very, very interesting model. My interview with one of the founders really inspired me, because they're really also paving the way to more diversity and inclusion in the workplace. They also really want to make the workplace accessible to everyone. So for 5 memberships paid, they offer one to a person who can't necessarily afford access to a co-working space. But also I think the thought process of designing their spaces and making it very, how can I say, like they really emphasized local artists, local writers, everything to the details have been really chosen with a reason. Nothing is there out of randomness. They really work with local artists and local providers to create their spaces and create an environment where they feel that they support the local community and they positively impact local businesses as well. Another example from Romania, which is called Hotspot. They actually just opened a second space in Bucharest. Really interesting, because they're rather targeted at teams and companies. So the model is still co-working, but the way they shape their spaces targets rather the needs of people who are in bigger teams, but still want to have this community feeling, a sense of belonging, and have common areas where they get access to a lot of events, more content that they would get if they would be in their own offices. Now moving on to Asia, I would like to highlight also a few concepts. One of them is from Bangkok in Thailand, and that might speak to some of you if you are architects or interior designers. The space is called Paperwork, but it was actually started by an architectural studio called Paper Space Asia. And what's really interesting is that they welcome interior designers and architects within their space. They have a material library where those interior designers and architects can access those materials for their personal projects or their client projects, but they also work together as a community on big projects. So for instance, they've been designing the office of Facebook, I think in Manila in the Philippines. They also worked on the office of Google in Bangkok, and they always select the best skills within the community to work on projects for their clients. Another example which was interesting for us when we met it, it's called Nagatacho Grid, and it started by a corporate company in Japan, in Tokyo. So that's, I mean, I don't know if I should call them corporate, but let's say they're a very big startup. And what they realized is that their office being located in the center of Tokyo, they would highly benefit from opening it to, they really restructured the company, and they tell their employees from tomorrow you can work from whenever you want and wherever you want, but we also want our building to be open to many people and many companies. So they started renting some floors to other startups, but also they started to offer part of the space for free to students and individuals who wanted to have access to a space for a day. And the only thing they ask them whenever you come to the space is to sign up with your email, so you can become a part of the community and get aware of events they're organizing, because they have events almost every day where they do presentations, but also, like you see downstairs or down, movie nights and book clubs. They also have a in-house daycare where parents can come with their little ones. So it's a very interesting ecosystem in itself that was started by a company. I've highlighted a lot of big cities, so I wanted to bring you to more remote area, still in Japan. Really interesting space called Morino Office. It's located in the forest, 2 hours away from Tokyo, accessible by train and by bus, very near the mountain. And it started by a former employee of Sony who really wanted to change his life. So he went to this village because he's a snowboarder and he really enjoyed the nature. So he found out about this village, met with the 80 years old mayor to tell him he was considering to move in that small city. I don't know if I should call it a village. And at the time, I think the city also had a very big decline in population. The mayor told him, oh, if you want to do anything, I have this building here, which used to be a summer camp for children. It's abandoned. If you ever want to do something with it, let me know. He took him for his word and he decided to make a co-working space out of it. His journey at the beginning was very hard. I think for a lot of people, they were not understanding what was co-working, but consistency and also the pandemic has accelerated a lot of things for him. Many families have actually moved to Fujimi, where he's based, relocated themselves. Many more businesses have opened there. And actually, they've, for the first time in decades, they've seen a regain in like demographics. Because young parents have been there, etc. And now he also opened a co-living space following the pandemic, where companies are coming on retreats to reconnect with their employees and also experiment with new ways of working. One last example, which I really love, it's called Senior Planet. This is a co-working space located in US. It started in New York. The founder is here on the picture. And actually, if you want to join, you need to be 60 years old. So under 60, you can't be a member. And the purpose of Senior Planet is to help the elderly stay connected to the world we live in. And the way they do that is by educating them to technology. So every day they organize classes on different topics: how to start an iPad, what's an iPad, what's an iWatch, how do I download Uber, what are fake news, how do I send an email. Very simple things, but his aim was really to help the elderly stay connected to where we are and the world we live in. And as you can see, they also educate them to like technologies, like video games, the metaverse, and other things. I'm almost done, so I just want to emphasize a few things before we get into the questions. why is co-working so important, and why do we made it our mission to advocate for co-working everywhere? I think, as you might have understood by now, and I hope you did, like, it really has the power to revive neighborhoods and buildings. It also brings sorry, a lot of new dynamics to work, something that is more community driven, a place where people connect on very different purposes that are not just work related. And of course, it provides easy and flexible accesses to a workplace to almost anyone. As I said earlier, co-working was in its early days very much for white collars, but we are also seeing a change in that. For instance, there are some examples I didn't highlight, but they are in the book. You also have now co-working spaces for doctors, co-working spaces for beauty professionals. In London, actually, there are quite a few. In France, we have some in the book that you can see, where hairdressers, makeup artists benefit from the model of co-working. Some examples of reviving neighborhoods. So what you see here is a space from the Czech Republic, which was one of the oldest print house factory from Central Eastern Europe. Now it's a co-working space called Opero, very beautiful. Another example here in Belgium, Fosbury and Son, taking over architectural buildings or buildings made by famous architects, transforming it into very beautiful co-working spaces. Another example down here, Ministry of New, based in Bombay in India, which has been elected the second most beautiful co-working space by Forbes. And then here you have another example from Spain, in the Canary Island, called Talleres Palermo. It used to be like a warehouse or to build I forgot what they were building, but you can see those machines. And now it's like a co-working space combined with like a second-hand furniture shop and a bar. Of course, that goes without saying that the industry and co-working spaces are facing challenges. It's quite hard today to run a co-working space. There was a survey at the end of 2021 that was shared among 1,230 co-working brands, and to ask them about the challenges they were experiencing back then. One of them was attracting new members, which I think was also very much driven by the pandemic and the uncertainty that was still there. But then, of course, financial constraints, not able to provide enough workspace. Sometimes it's frustrating. General workload and administrative tasks are still a big challenge for co-working spaces, because you might not realize it, but it's really operationally heavy to run a co-working space. And of course, the real estate market and high prices makes it more challenging for co-working spaces to propose competitive prices or remain remain attractive to people who can't necessarily afford it. And then, yeah, community engagement is always a challenge, competition over other co-working spaces. Sometimes in smaller cities, there tends to be too many offerings, so that's hard. Sometimes also because of a lack of education. Sorry, I'm gonna drink some water. Because of a lack of education about what co-working is, there would be insufficient local market demand. And then, of course, also sometimes there are some bad paying habits from members, which puts the business of co-working at risk. Now, and before we end the session, what are some of the predictions we see? At Co-working Europe, there was actually a presentation by the Instant Group, where the person on stage was highlighting that co-working is actually the only growing sector in workspaces. There's really high demand at the moment for co-working everywhere, and he was predicting quite a high growth. As you can see, 2/3 of companies worldwide allow for remote working, so there is a huge potential, not just for co-working, but let's say for flexible workspace operators to thrive even more in the coming years, which actually has a direct impact on the number of co-working spaces worldwide, as you can see here. Right now we are here, 28,000 or so co-working spaces, and by 2024, the number is expected to almost double, a bit less than double, but kind of. So you see it's a big jump from today to in 2 years from now. And of course, I think also the industry is going to a more eco-conscious spaces, operators and users. People understand how sustainable or more eco-conscious choice co-working is, because you don't have to own or buy any of those things. They're all shared. Co-working spaces are also becoming destinations, and they're positioning themselves within hospitality ecosystems. You see more and more co-working spaces happening in hotels. Yesterday, I was presenting at another event where We were also discussing the correlation between retail and co-working. I think there was a project recently by H&M and IKEA, for instance, in London. And of course, co-working will keep on diversify its models. So it will go beyond what we see as like offices. As I just said, you start to see co-working spaces in airports, railway stations, trains, because it will support more and more professionals in accessing experience-driven workspaces everywhere. But there's also, I think, one more space that we should not ignore, and co-working spaces are also looking into it, which is the digital space. More and more, we are wondering how co-working will play into the metaverse. So how will we create new digital experiences in the workplace? There are also a lot of technologies that are digitally connecting workspaces. So that's a Japanese company called Tonari, where they do huge screens that are connected live, and you can interact with your colleagues in real life, kind of. So they look at the same size as you. And again, this is to emphasize the experience and the digital connection of the workplace. And a little a visual I find interesting, which also goes along the lines of experience-driven type of workplaces, saying this is our new skydiving desks. So people will look to consume the workplace because there are experiences offered to them and not just because they have to. Because I think by now, this is also something we've understood. People do not have to return to the office, and they also don't want necessarily to return, especially if they have high commuting times. So co-working spaces that are in residential neighborhoods, co-working spaces that are closer to people, they also attract those workers, and they offer them experiences through events and through the way the space is shaped, which is really different from a traditional office. And I'll give you 3 takeaways before we wrap things up and look into your questions. If you haven't tried co-working yet, I would invite you after this session to look out for one around you and go try it for a day. When you choose it, if you have the choice, make sure to select a space that seems interesting to you, not just any space, but also if you have an experience in that space that you didn't particularly like, don't think that's all what the co-working spaces are offering. Try out some more and find differently. So I would like to ask you, what would be your co-working recipe looking like? That's it. Thank you very much for listening to me. If you want to connect on LinkedIn, here are my details. I think you'll have also everything in the recap email afterwards. And I look forward to our questions.
Thank you very much. We've been on a global tour.
Yes.
Just from our desk. That's been fantastic. And I can't imagine how exhausting your tour must have been, but also how exciting. We do have a few questions. If you wanted to stop sharing your screen,
Sure.
actually, the easiest way for me to do that is just great. So, well, thank you, everyone. There are a few observations, and
Yeah.
the one that you have heard me comment so many times about when I've spoken on co-working events is ergonomics.
Yeah.
So many co-working spaces look like social spaces rather than workspaces. Is that being addressed? Is it an issue you ever discussed with any of the owners, that it feels like they're touchdown spaces rather than workspaces?
So that's a great question. For instance, where I'm currently at, the city I'm at, there is one co-working space, and they're actually what you just referred to as social space. Because for me, the ergonomics and the interior design that they did has not been made for me to actually do some productive work in there. We do see that is changing. I think a good example, for instance, is to look at Berlin. Berlin used to be all about secondhand furniture, upcycling furnitures and everything. And now when we see the new co-working openings, we see much more investment done into interior design. So people start to work with interior designers and architects because those are skills that if you don't know, you can't invent them, and they're important. And then, of course, for instance, we were at Orgatech. We also spoke there, and we realized that a lot of the furniture providers and furniture companies are also trying to cater now to that flexible demand. So, for instance, we also have to understand that co-working spaces, they're not all really big. So for them, flexibility is really important. And for a very long time, I think furniture providers were not necessarily putting their furnitures on rolls, or they were not allowing for furniture to be moved around easily. After attending Orgatech, I have to say this is changing. There is a lot more flexibility happening in furniture design and furniture in general. So I think this is also entering co-working spaces. But yes, you're absolutely correct. Many brands, and it's interesting because there is a higher interest by co-working operators to educate themselves on those topics. How do we become better on the ergonomic side? And how do we actually invest in better furnitures, because it's not about just buying IKEA chairs that won't last very long because they are used all day actually and quite heavily. So how do we invest in better furniture? And how do we learn how to create those spaces where people can be productive while there is life happening through events and other things? So I wouldn't say that we are there yet, but I can say from my observations that we are getting there. And we do have brands that are really, you know, well aware of that, and they have inter-design teams and architects in-house that do that. But for those who don't, I do see a change in mindsets.
Yeah, because sometimes it feels like you're in a bric-a-brac store. Sometimes when you go to some of those almost, they're almost social spaces in so much as they're community spaces where people have pulled a few bits together rather than, and John actually observes that some co-working spaces have limited or poor support for the use of video collaboration, poorly ventilated or very tiny phone booths.
I think whenever you notice those things as users, I would also advise you to give it as a feedback to co-working spaces, because the more they will hear it, the more they will start to do something about it. We see it. I mean, we have seen 500 spaces by now, and it takes me a few minutes now to understand how the experience has been put together. Is it good or not? And I always give those feedbacks, because sometimes you enter the space, it doesn't smell very good, there's nobody to greet you. As you rightfully said, the internet connection doesn't seem to be very correct, or it's too loud. But I think for operators, because they're in there every day, they just don't realize this anymore. So if you have a bad experience as a user, don't feel afraid, or don't be afraid to actually tell them. They need to know, because otherwise there will be no way for them to get better.
Yeah, and thank you. Ronan raises a point that I made a note of. Do they all manage to monetize their space and build sustainable business models? Obviously, in light of WeWork, and some of the challenges, is it a profitable venture? What are the best ingredients to make it successful that you've observed?
Again, very great question. Co-working is, for a very long time and still today, if it's just about renting desks, you will probably just make it break even. You won't be profitable. But one of the trends we see at the moment is like hyper monetization of everything, and spaces who have more room so to experiment things. For instance, they would organize different kind of events. They also now, one big trend is around phone booth, or like a podcast booth and everything booth. So they start, for instance, to monetize those to creators from the city who do not necessarily need an access to a co-working space, but they would be happy to actually access a professional podcast studio for a few hours. Of course, you don't make millions out of renting a space for podcasting, but it's just an example. There are a lot. One thing I think you were sharing, Mark, recently at one of the events where we were together was also the office usage that is changing right now, with people going less and less to the office on Monday and Friday. This is also a reflection in co-working spaces. For the co-working spaces that are not in residential areas, they do see less people on Monday and Friday. So now they're wondering, what do I do with this space? How do I keep on monetizing it? And the way for spaces to improve their business models is also to make better usage of data. So now they start to work with more data to understand when the space is used, when is it not used, and they start to offer it to different audiences. For instance, more and more weddings, more and more anniversaries in the weekends are happening in co-working spaces. I remember in Norway, we also had a co-working space telling us that they were organizing funerals in their co-working space because funeral venues were too expensive and too sad, and the people wanted an alternative, so they did it there. So I think the monetization is still something co-working spaces are not afraid to innovate with. And it's also a point I often make. It's an office space for a company doesn't have to monetize their office, right? They just buy it for the employees to be able to access the workplace. Whereas co-working spaces, they do need to monetize. So they are really looking into monetization of all the services they have. And yeah, today we do see interesting innovations happening in that space.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And Klaus has a question. Is there kind of an average size of a typical co-working space? Is it, is it small, medium? Are they 100 places? What's a typical average size?
So that's again a very good question. The smallest space we have in the book was 25 square meters. They had 30 members and people were using it whenever they wanted day and night. One startup exited from there, I should say, $700 million, space from Denmark. So that was quite impressive. But to get back to your question, I think to really be able to generate revenue from a co-working space and experiment, our experience is that you need at least 500 square meters, which is 5,000 square feet. Below that, it starts to be a little bit more difficult. And usually, people always experiment, so I don't want to make generalization. But we do see a lot of the operators running spaces anywhere between 500 to 1,500 square meters. But of course, it also varies depending on the regions. Sometimes, of course, the big players like WeWork, Spaces, they have huge amount of space and huge amount of square meters. But yeah, I think anywhere between 1,000 to 1,500 is usually what we see when we travel.
Okay, thank you very much. A great question from Stephanie. Have you seen success or experimentation in maybe shopping malls or more suburban areas, for example?
There are, interestingly enough, there are a few co-working spaces we've came across in shopping malls, one in Portugal and one in India. And actually, it's kind of a match made in heaven for some reason. It works very well. The one we saw in India was really interesting because aside from the co-working elements, they also implemented a kids' playground. So parents would go in the shopping mall, leave the kids in the playground, and then they would work from the co-working space. And they were really popular. And then, of course, suburban areas, yes. We have also plenty of examples in the book. And I think post-COVID, it's becoming even bigger as a trend. Many operators, even the big brands, are looking at suburban areas because they understand that we do not want to take the tube for 45 minutes if we don't have to. So having co-working spaces closer to home makes a whole lot of sense. So we do see that also as a rising trend in any region of the world, actually. I can make a generalization there. It's popping up everywhere. And yeah, that's my answer.
Great, thank you. One of the models actually at WeWork was almost to help companies take some of their spaces. And one of the reasons for that was corporate identity. So they kind of had their own identity. And someone's raised that issue that if companies move to a co-working office, do they lose their own company identity or culture or even their branding? So thank you, Wayne, for that question.
It's an interesting question, and I think because it has been raised many times, operators are actually now starting to tackle that challenge. So you do have co-working brands. I'm thinking about one in London, for instance, called Canvas Offices, that actually offers companies the possibility to brand the space with their own branding so they don't lose their DNA. But then they offer also the co-working model. So it's a big building. You share the building, but each floor that the company takes would be personalized to what they want. In smaller spaces, it's harder to do because this has a cost. But we do see brands looking into that very much to offer larger companies a chance to not lose their DNA or to keep their branding intact or present in the office for people who come and use it.
Thank you. I saw a question. Sharon asked a question about the initial costs are quite high. How do people fund these? Is it self-funded? Do they get investors? What's the kind of the financial models?
Also a big topic that we discussed heavily at Coworking Europe. I think coworking in general is underfunded as an industry. Things look different in certain markets. For instance, New York or London. I think for operators there, raising through investments, VCs, for instance, is a little bit easier. And I'm just saying a little bit. A lot of the operators would fund it themselves with banks. But again, it's very difficult because banks don't really they don't want to support this kind of business. They think it's too dangerous. Also, very often they don't understand it. So now, for the funny story, we have co-working spaces who buy the book to offer it to their bank to show them that the industry is growing, is here to stay, and they want to educate their bankers so that people understand what they're up to. Some co-working spaces do interesting partnerships. We have co-working spaces in the book who partnered with their city, with their locality, public institution, like in Rome. We have a co-working space who actually got the space funded by the city of Rome. We see also the French government is doing that. They are offering in suburban areas public spaces for people who want to start co-working spaces within them to repopulate or help people living in suburban areas or smaller size cities have access to workplaces. And then funding, of course, also comes from different business models. So for instance, instead of being leasing the space, operators now are starting to do different business models as like partnering with landlords, revenue share, profit share. So we start to see innovations also along those lines where the investment is kind of shared between the landlords and the operators.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask one final question, and Hella makes a great point that a lot of co-working images, and they're the ones you've showed, seem like very open, social, together spaces. But do they consider the other settings for different kinds of work, silent and concentration, that kind of stuff? Is that starting to increase? Because it does feel like private work wasn't always catered for very well.
Yes, indeed. So what we see now also rising in co-working spaces around the world is the library concept, which I'm personally a fan of, because I agree with you that sometimes, I do love being in the co-working space because it's so open and I see a lot of people, but I'm a visually distracted person. So if I see things around me, I would be very distracted. And in a co-working space, I'm basically 24/7 distracted because there's always something. But now many co-working spaces are implementing the library concept. So you have a room where you can't even touch your phone and it's absolute silence, just so people can actually do productive work whenever they need it. There is also a bigger investment into phone booth because you might have encountered people in co-working spaces who are constantly on the phone and they don't really care about the people around them. So now spaces, because of course the meeting room usage is always a question in co-working spaces. I think someone should open a co-working space just with meeting rooms and it would still not be enough meeting rooms. So that's why co-working are looking at phone booth at the moment because they're easier to implement and they push people to use more of those. And of course, the phone booth also are usually better built for isolation and reduction of noise. So we do see that changing. I should say that one difficult thing for some of the operators who actually have in their hands older buildings, so not new builds or type A type of offices, the challenge is always that you have an old structure and working with isolation of an old structure is extremely expensive. I remember the space that we used to run that had no isolation at all. And if we wanted to do something, it was in the hundreds of thousands of euros to invest. So sometimes it's a challenge, but I think also, as I said, and coming back from Orgatech, we see a lot of innovation into that topic of providing spaces that are really well isolated for productive work in open spaces. So I do see that changing. And did you ask me about collaboration or you said concentration? Sorry.
Yeah, it's concentration.
Okay, yeah. So that's my answer.
Pauline, thank you very much for a fantastic session, and there will be a follow-up afterwards. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. As you leave, you will be taken to the survey and let us know what you thought. My apologies about the technical issues that we've had, and thank you for all those that persevered. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and there will be a lucky one of you that will win a copy of the book, and we will be in touch. Lots of thank yous coming in the chat box now.
Thanks everyone for coming. Yeah.
Upcoming webinars. There's still time to register for the later one if you've got any colleagues that you might want to join. Unfortunately, our speaker next month was going to be Neil Usher. That's now been pushed back to April. We're getting a new speaker for next month, but lots of other speakers coming up. So do check out the website that I've just posted. So Thank you, Pauline, for a fantastic.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. As I say, your applause comes in the chat box these days. So
Thank you.
thank you very much.